She stood there, trembling, not from fear, not anymore, but from something deeper, something the world hadn't seen in her for a long time. Grace's bare foot touched the polished wooden floor as if it were a promise, and in that quiet second, the ballroom, packed with hundreds of people dressed in their finest, went utterly silent. There were no violins. No instructions. Just a girl in a simple ivory dress, scarred but standing, and the impossible moment of her taking one step forward. That one step was all it took for the entire room to rise in a wave of gasps, tears, and something dangerously close to awe. They said miracles were loud. They said comebacks needed fanfare. But here she was, no music, no cue, just the echo of her heel hitting the ground, and the world felt like it had been holding its breath for her all this time. Michael Lancaster, the billionaire who never cried, who once walked out of a hospital and never looked back, was the first to fall to his knees. He didn't know how he got there, how his body had responded before his mind could catch up. His vision blurred, not from the spotlight, but from the weight of realization. Grace was dancing again. Not because someone told her she could. But because for the first time in 7 years, she wanted to. The last time he'd seen her try to take a step, she collapsed. Her face twisted in pain and rage, and the world said she'd never move again. Not like that. Not freely. Not beautifully. That day, something inside him broke, and he told himself he was never the kind of man who should have held hope. But this? This wasn't just a step. It was a resurrection. People clapped but not out of celebration. It was the sound of disbelief, of hearts cracking open, of souls remembering what it felt like to believe in someone again. She didn't look at him. Not yet. She looked straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the child in the front row. A little girl no older than 5, with curls too wild for a comb and eyes too knowing for her age. She clutched a drawing in her hand, one that had fallen on the stage minutes earlier. A drawing of a woman dancing beneath stars, stick figure, yellow crayon hair, arms raised. At the bottom was one sentence in wobbly handwriting, "I wish my mommy could dance again." Grace took one more step. Then another. Her body moved with a slight hitch, like a melody learning how to find its rhythm again. But it was happening. Her right arm floated into position, her spine elongated like it remembered everything it had once been capable of. And even as a tear slid down her cheek, she smiled. The kind of smile that comes after a storm you thought would never end. People whispered her name, some in reverence, others in disbelief. The cameras, which had once chased her downfall like vultures, were now desperately trying to catch a miracle mid-flight. But it wasn't their eyes she danced for. It was for the girl in the front row. And the man still kneeling on the far side of the room, hands trembling, lips parted as if begging the moment not to end. Michael still remembered the day she lost everything. Not because he read about it. Not because the tabloids made it front-page news. But because he was there. Because he held her hand when her spine snapped mid-rehearsal. Because she looked at him through tears and said, "Don't let them see me like this." And he didn't. But he also didn't stay. Grace twirled. Not a perfect pirouette. But her body remembered enough. Enough to defy every doctor's chart, every diagnosis, every line in her own journal that said she'd never do this again. And when she finally stopped, she didn't collapse. She bowed. A breathless standing ovation followed. Not because it was choreographed. But because sometimes the soul doesn't wait for instruction, it just rises. The little girl stood up too. The drawing crumpled in her hands. And for the first time in her life, she shouted without fear, "That's my mommy." The room went still. Michael gasped. Grace looked up. And their eyes met. For a moment, everything that had been buried came back, like a wave crashing so hard it didn't just drench them, it dragged them under. Her betrayal. His silence. The lie that held them apart. The secret that could ruin them both. Because that child, that beautiful, wide-eyed little girl, wasn't supposed to exist. And yet she did. And now the world knew. Michael stood slowly. Not to run. But to breathe again. His voice cracked as he whispered something he hadn't said in years. "She's mine." Grace didn't respond. Not with words. She simply nodded. And the lights dimmed. Not because the show was over, but because it had just begun. 3 days before the gala, Grace hadn't even looked at a mirror. The city buzzed around her as if her name hadn't once graced every billboard and ballet season announcement. She walked past posters now featuring younger dancers, limbs like liquid silk, faces untouched by pain, and all she could do was pull her scarf tighter. They didn't recognize her anymore. Maybe that was a gift. Or maybe it was the last insult from a life that had already taken too much. She didn't plan to go to the event. In fact, she had torn the invitation in half and stuffed it in the trash. Not out of bitterness, but out of fear. Fear that someone might look at her and still expect the old Grace. Fear that someone might not look at her at all. But mostly, fear that he would be there. Michael Lancaster. She hadn't said his name out loud in 6 years. Not once. But somehow, it still sat on her tongue like something sour and sweet at the same time. Every step he took away from her that day in the hospital echoed louder than the applause she used to chase. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't say anything. Just vanished. And still, part of her kept hoping he'd knock on her door, one ordinary afternoon, and say the words she'd needed most: "I was wrong. I'm sorry. Let me come back." But he never did. Grace ran her fingers along the edge of the worn envelope sitting on her counter. It had no stamp. No return address. Just her name, written in thick ink. Inside was the invitation, unsigned, but she knew who had sent it. There was only one person who ever called her Miss G, Sienna, with that flourish of a final, like a bow on a present. Michael. She picked it up again. The gala was in honor of a new charity program, one designed to help underprivileged children explore art and movement therapy. The founder had remained anonymous, until now. The press claimed the man funding it was a mysterious patron with a past in the performing arts. But Grace didn't need a press release to recognize who cared about kids who couldn't afford shoes, let alone ballet slippers. That had been their dream. Not just hers. The Phoenix Steps Initiative. He had taken the name from her old studio, the one that burned down the year after her accident. The one he rebuilt without ever telling anyone. The one she visited sometimes at night, watching from across the street like a ghost haunting her own past. She should have stayed home. She should have protected her daughter. She should have let sleeping scars lie. But she didn't. Because when her daughter drew that picture, Mommy dancing again, arms stretched to the sky, something inside her cracked. And something else stepped through. At first, it was just a shuffle. A whisper of rhythm in her bones. Then came the trembling. The tears. The moment she stood alone in the dark of her apartment, holding onto the counter for balance, one toe pointed out of habit. That's when it happened. She turned on the music. The same track she once used for her first solo. Debussy. And with hands shaking and heart pounding, she moved. Not gracefully. Not confidently. But truthfully. Her body didn't betray her. Not entirely. And when she stopped, she found herself crying, not from pain, but from a whisper she hadn't heard in years: "You're still here." She turned to her daughter, who had snuck out of bed and watched the whole thing, eyes round with wonder. "Do it again," she had whispered. Grace nodded through tears. That's how it started. She said yes to the gala. She didn't tell anyone. Not her friends. Not her daughter's school. Not even her therapist. She ordered a simple dress online and picked it up from a neighbor's porch so no one would ask questions. She practiced in secret, late at night, in her socks, one hand on the wall. 3 days. That's all she gave herself. 3 days to decide if she would take the stage again, or let the world believe she had disappeared for good. The ballroom was brighter than she remembered. That night, she entered through the back. No makeup team. No red carpet. Just her, clutching her daughter's hand, a trembling breath caught behind her ribs. No one recognized her at first. But the moment her name was whispered near the dessert table, it spread like electricity. Is that Grace Sienna? She's walking. Wasn't she? She kept her eyes down. Until she saw him. Michael stood across the room, surrounded by people but somehow more alone than anyone else. His hair was silver now. His jaw sharper. But his eyes, they hadn't changed. Still the color of storms. Still unreadable. He hadn't seen her yet. Not really. But when their daughter tugged at her hand and whispered, "Is that him?" Grace's heart seized. She nodded once. Swallowed a storm. He still didn't know. He didn't even know she was alive in this way. That she had found pieces of herself again. That their one night had left something behind, a heartbeat, a miracle, a girl who loved to draw pictures of stars and mothers who danced beneath them. That girl was watching now. And Grace realized something that shattered her fear completely. It wasn't about the gala. Or Michael. Or the whispers. It was about that drawing. That child. That promise. She stepped forward. 1 foot. Then another. The world didn't stop spinning. But the people did. And somewhere between her second breath and her third step, she knew, this wasn't the end of her story. It was the part where everything she thought she'd lost finally started to come back. One move at a time. 3 years earlier, before the lights, before the applause, before the headlines called her the girl who danced through fire, Grace was just a name on a student list at Carson Academy. And even that almost didn't happen. Her mother had scribbled the application form at the hospital cafeteria while waiting for the latest in a string of results. Grace had been in remission then, a fragile hope wrapped in gauze and quiet prayers. But deep down, they both knew the clock was always ticking. Back then, Grace was just a girl with hair falling in soft waves, eyes too old for 17, and legs that ached every time she climbed the stairs. Yet, she danced. Not for stages. Not for awards. Just in the kitchen, with the radio humming something nostalgic. Just in her bedroom, when the world outside felt too loud. She danced the way some people breathe, to stay alive. Mrs. Devine, the Academy's director, had hesitated when she saw the medical file. Brittle bones. Respiratory limits. History of lymphoma. Severe fatigue. And yet, Grace had said in the interview, smiling gently, "I can still move." Her mother had held her breath beside her. The director tilted her head. "Why do you want to dance here, Grace?" Grace had answered without looking away. "Because I know how to fall. And I know how to get back up." Somehow, that had been enough. The months that followed were a symphony of strain and sweat. While other students stretched with ease, Grace calculated each breath. Every pirouette was a gamble. Every leap came with the chance of a fracture. But she stayed. And not once did she ask for pity. She only asked for time. At night, she iced her knees and replayed footage of old performances on her cracked phone. There was one clip she watched more than the others. A grainy video titled, "Dance Under Rain." A duet. A boy and girl swirling in a storm, their bodies speaking languages no words could hold. She never saw their faces clearly. But she remembered the boy's final move, a slow, reverent lift of the girl above his head, as if offering her to the sky. She watched it like others read scripture. One evening, as autumn painted the campus in strokes of gold and crimson, Grace found herself alone in Studio B. Her usual partner had skipped. Something about a last-minute audition in LA. The space echoed with silence. Then, the door creaked. She turned. A boy stepped in, unfamiliar yet oddly familiar. Tall, dark curls slightly unruly, eyes that held the weight of sleepless nights and distant dreams. He didn't speak. Just placed a bag by the wall and nodded toward the speaker. "Mind if I join?" She shrugged, cautious. "If you can keep up." He smiled, and it was the kind that made time stutter. When the music played, something shifted. He didn't follow her, he anticipated her. Like a shadow that danced with light. Like he knew her rhythm before she even moved. Every twirl, every reach, every fall, he was there. Catching. Matching. Breathing with her. When the final note lingered in the air, they both stood still, breathless. "You dance like you're fighting a storm," he said. She tilted her head. "And you dance like you've been struck by lightning." He laughed, and something about it echoed. "I'm Aiden," he said. She froze. The name on the video. The boy who had lifted the girl in the rain. "Grace," she replied, and suddenly her voice felt too small. They didn't talk about it that night. Not the video. Not the familiarity. They just danced again. And again. Over the next few weeks, something unspoken grew between them. They never labeled it. Never kissed. But in every practice, every shared silence, every knowing glance, it bloomed. Then came the invitation. The revival gala, Mrs. Devine had announced. "We've been asked to send one original duet. A chance to represent the Academy. It'll be televised. Sponsored. The world will be watching." Dozens of pairs auditioned. But the day Aiden and Grace performed, the studio held its breath. Their routine was unlike anything else. It was quiet. Raw. A story of falling and flying. Of holding on and letting go. When they finished, no one clapped for a full 10 seconds. Then came the standing ovation. They were chosen. For weeks, they rehearsed endlessly. Between classes. Through injuries. Around hospital visits, Grace kept quiet. She didn't tell him about the headaches. Or the numbness. Or the new scan. Until the night he found her collapsed near the dressing room, her skin pale as frost. He sat beside her, wordless. She waited for questions. For anger. Instead, he placed his hand over hers. "If you can still move," he whispered, echoing her old words, "then I'm staying." She cried then. Not because of pain. But because someone finally didn't flinch. 2 nights before the gala, Grace didn't show up. Aiden waited. Then called. No answer. The next morning, he went to the hospital. Security refused him entry. "Family only." "She is," he almost said. But he turned away. Grace watched him from the 3rd-floor window. Watched him stand there. Wait. And finally, walk away. She whispered to the glass, "Don't give up on me yet." Because she hadn't given up. Not yet. The night air was crisp when Grace found herself standing outside the old theater, the one with cracked marble steps and faded red curtains still visible through the dusty glass doors. Her breath fogged in the cold, but she didn't notice. All she could think about was the way his eyes had lingered too long, as if searching for something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something he recognized. Something he feared. Inside, the lights flickered dimly. The gala was over, but her thoughts weren't. She replayed the conversation again and again. The way Anthony Lancaster had asked her that one question with too much familiarity. "Have we met before?" Not in a polite way. Not in the casual way rich people sometimes asked staff just to feign interest. No. His tone had cracked somewhere between fear and disbelief. And her silence hadn't helped. Back at her small apartment, Grace unpinned her name tag and sank onto the worn sofa. Her fingers trembled as she opened the old shoebox under her bed, a box that held pieces of a life she'd long buried. Inside was a single black and white photo. Faded at the edges, but still intact. A girl no older than 10 stood beside a piano, beaming. And behind her, a woman in a flowing dress, mid-turn, caught in a motion too graceful to be frozen in time. Grace's mother. She traced the image with her fingertip, remembering the scent of cinnamon and honey that used to cling to her mother's scarf, the one she now kept wrapped in plastic to preserve the last of that scent. Her mother had danced on that very stage once. And her father, well, that's where the truth blurred. Because no matter how many times Grace asked, her mother had never named him. Except once. In a whisper. On a hospital bed. Tell him, she dances like me. It meant nothing then. But now. Anthony Lancaster had watched her too closely. Like he wasn't seeing just her. But someone he'd lost. Someone he never expected to see reflected in the face of a caterer serving flutes of champagne and hiding a tremble in her wrist. The next morning, Grace sat on the subway, the box in her lap, staring out at the blur of Brooklyn. Her shift didn't start for hours, but she had somewhere else to go. A place she hadn't visited in years, the Lancaster Foundation's Historical Archive Wing, open to the public, but only by appointment. She had made one. Under another name. The building stood like a cathedral to wealth and legacy. Portraits of dignified men lined the marble halls, all sharing the same Lancaster jawline and gaze of quiet arrogance. Grace walked slowly, letting the silence settle around her like a fog. In a corner room labeled, Past Beneficiaries, she found the wall she hadn't dared look at since she was 17. Tucked behind glass was a photo from a gala held 2 decades ago. Her mother, Alana Monroe, mid-spin in a flowing white dress, dancing beside a man whose face had been blurred in the archival scan. But Grace knew that frame. She knew that jawline. Anthony. The door creaked behind her. You shouldn't be in here. She turned sharply. A woman in her 50s stood there, clipboard in hand. Grace offered a smile, calm despite the storm brewing inside her. I'm researching a piece for a small publication, she lied smoothly. A profile on underrecognized performers. The woman's eyes narrowed. Alana Monroe, she was talented. Grace nodded. Did you know her? No. But Mr. Lancaster did. Very well, from what I heard. Grace swallowed. How well? The woman shrugged. There were whispers, but no one ever confirmed anything. She vanished from the circuit not long after that photo was taken. Vanished. Moved. Left the company. Disappeared. Some say she got pregnant. But you know how rumors are. Grace's knees felt weak. She turned back to the photo. Her mother, eyes glowing, spinning toward the man just out of focus. She whispered to herself, you knew. That night, she danced. Not on stage. Not for applause. But alone, in her living room, with the lights dimmed and the music barely audible. Just enough to feel the rhythm her mother once carried in her veins. Grace moved like she hadn't in years. As if her body remembered truths her mind had tried to forget. And when the music slowed, she didn't cry. She breathed. And then she called him. She didn't know why. Maybe to test him. Maybe to see if he'd tremble too. Mr. Lancaster, she said when he answered. His voice had that clipped edge of someone caught off guard. Yes. This is Grace. From the gala. I was wondering if you might need assistance for the upcoming charity showcase. I used to be involved in choreography. A pause. Too long. Then, yes. Come tomorrow. No pleasantries. Just permission. Like he was granting her entry into a place that frightened him. When she arrived, the studio was already lit. Mirrors stretched from floor to ceiling, and the scent of varnish and fresh flowers hung in the air. He stood at the far end, his back to her, watching a dancer rehearse with stiff formality. Grace didn't speak. She walked across the floor, dropped her bag, and stretched. The dancer faltered, watching her, and Anthony turned. Their eyes locked. "Would you care to demonstrate?" he asked. Her laugh was soft, bitter. "You don't remember, do you?" His brow furrowed. "Should I?" She walked past him, standing center stage. Her body aligned. Her eyes closed. And she danced. It wasn't a performance. It was a memory. Each step carried the weight of a child who had watched from the wings, a teenager who had given up scholarships to care for a dying parent, a woman who had scrubbed floors while others pirouetted past her. And as the music faded, she looked directly at him. "Alana Monroe was my mother." He didn't speak. Didn't blink. Just stared. And in that moment, she saw it. The collapse of certainty. The fracture of time. He stepped back. No. But he knew. And she didn't need him to say it. She had taken just one step. And the world had started watching her dance again. She didn't come the next day. Or the one after. Damien checked every gallery corridor, every back row of every auditorium, and even the rooftop cafe where he'd once seen her pause by the glass to watch the sun fall. But she wasn't there. Not her scarf. Not her gaze. Not even the faint echo of her presence. He didn't ask about her, he knew better. The kind of woman who carries silence like a second skin doesn't appreciate being hunted. She returns on her own time. If she returns at all. On the third night, he returned to the same room where they'd spoken. The gallery had emptied out. The painting, the storm-colored one, still hung there, but somehow it felt smaller now. He sat on the bench across from it, letting the weight of the space wrap around him. There were things he should be doing. Contracts. Emails. Phone calls. But none of them mattered. Not tonight. Not when all he could think about was the look in her eyes when she said she didn't know what came next. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, palms pressed together. He had built a life out of knowing the next step. From the courtroom to the boardroom, from the gala stage to the headlines, he had controlled every frame of his narrative. Except this one. Except her. He remembered something then. A conversation, years ago, with a woman he once trusted too much. When you meet someone who stops time, she had said, run. Because if you don't, they'll become the only clock you hear ticking. And now Grace had returned, just long enough to make silence unbearable. Across the city, she stood in her mother's kitchen, stirring soup that refused to simmer. The windows fogged with steam, her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was miles away. She could still feel the texture of the photo he had sent. Still hear his voice in the quiet of the gallery, that soft invitation to step forward, not as a dancer, not as a ghost, but as herself. Whoever that was now. Her mother shuffled in from the bedroom, wrapped in 2 layers of scarves and a robe 3 sizes too big. "You're quiet," she murmured. Grace offered a faint smile. "Just tired." "Of what?" She paused. "Of remembering." The old woman nodded, as if that made perfect sense. She reached for the chipped ceramic mug that had been hers since before Grace was born. "Is it the boy?" Grace blinked. "What boy?" Her mother didn't answer. She just sipped the tea and said, "Some memories wear their shoes too loudly." Later that night, Grace sat alone in her childhood bedroom, the one with peeling wallpaper and a slanted ceiling. She opened the small wooden box she'd sworn never to touch again. Inside, folded like old wounds, were the artifacts of a life left unfinished, a broken point shoe, a ribbon stained with sweat, a page torn from a dance program where her name had once been printed in gold. She reached in, pulled out the item at the bottom, the one she never let herself look at. A sketch. Black ink on yellowing paper. A girl midair, arms extended, feet pointed with heartbreaking clarity. It wasn't signed. But it didn't need to be. She exhaled, slow and ragged. Her fingers trembled as she traced the lines. She hadn't known then that someone had captured her like this. That she'd been seen. Not just watched, but seen. The next morning, she left the house before dawn. Her mother didn't ask where she was going. The streets were still half asleep, blinking under the weight of mist and the slow promise of sunrise. She walked until her legs ached, until the city shifted around her from gray to gold. And when she stopped, she was standing outside the place she hadn't dared return to in 6 years. The conservatory. Its steps were cracked now. The ivy had overgrown one of the pillars. But it still held the shape of her dreams. She stepped inside, nodding silently at the security guard who barely looked up from his crossword puzzle. He wouldn't remember her. That was a mercy. She wandered through the halls like a ghost retracing its death. Past the recital rooms, the studios, the wall of trophies that hadn't changed since her photo was removed. When she reached the practice room at the end of the south wing, she paused. The door creaked when she opened it. It was empty. Of course. But the air still smelled faintly of resin and dust. The mirror along the far wall had a new crack down the left side, splitting the reflection like a wound. She stepped to the center of the floor. Closed her eyes. Let her fingers lift, just slightly, as if tuning an invisible orchestra only she could hear. The music didn't start. But her body remembered. One step. Just one. And something in her spine realigned. Not a performance. Not an act. Just breath. Movement. Life. She didn't know how long she stayed there. Long enough for the light to shift. For her shadow to stretch and shrink again. When she finally left, she didn't look back. Damien received a message that afternoon. No words. Just a photo. Her foot. In motion. Hovering above a scuffed studio floor. The edges of the mirror framing her like a painting. He stared at it for a long time. Then replied with only 2 words, still watching. That night, at the Foundation's winter event, he arrived late. He didn't make a speech. He didn't smile for cameras. He stood in the back, arms crossed, heart somewhere between his throat and the edge of every memory he tried to bury. And then she walked in. Not with grandeur. Not with a spotlight. Just a quiet grace that made every head turn even before they saw her face. She wore no makeup. No jewelry. Just a black dress and eyes that had stopped apologizing for carrying storms. Their eyes met. This time, she didn't look away. He stepped aside as she moved closer to the gallery wall, where a sculpture of bent metal and broken glass spiraled upward like a soul clawing its way out of silence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed too fragile for sound. She traced a line of light along the sculpture's edge with her eyes, as if it whispered something only she could hear. He waited, hands in pockets, unsure if this was the moment she would finally leave again, or stay. "I saw your email," she said at last. Her voice was quieter than he remembered, less certain, like a violin retuned after years of dust. "I wasn't sure you'd answer. I almost didn't." He looked at her profile in the soft light, the sharpness of her jaw, the way her hair fell like a curtain she'd forgotten to raise. "Why'd you come?" Grace exhaled slowly, eyes still fixed ahead. "Because you sent a photo of my foot. And I couldn't stop staring at it." He smiled, but it faded quickly. It wasn't just a photo. It was proof. She turned to him then. Really turned. And he saw what time had carved into her. Not lines. Not age. But stillness. A kind of permanent awareness. Of herself. Of others. Of pain. Proof of what? She asked. That you still exist. She blinked, once, then looked down at her shoes. They weren't heels. Just soft flats, worn at the toes. She shifted slightly, as if remembering the weight of point shoes and how they once made her feel like she could leave the ground without permission. I didn't stop dancing because of the injury, she said suddenly. That's what the papers said. But that wasn't it. He tilted his head. Then why? She ran her fingers along the hem of her sleeve, as if searching for something to hold. Because when I fell, no one caught me. Not just physically. I mean, no one even noticed I was gone. Not really. He said nothing. What could he say? Grace continued, her voice thinner now. One day, I was everywhere, magazines, interviews, billboards. And then, nothing. Just silence. I kept waiting for someone to ask where I'd gone. But all I got were headlines about the next rising star. Damien's throat tightened. I noticed. She looked up, something sharp in her expression. You were gone too. He nodded, accepting the blow. I was a coward. You were my mentor. I was afraid of what I felt. Grace stepped back, as if the air itself had turned electric. Then say it. Say what you felt. Damien didn't flinch. I loved you. Back then. Not the dancer. Not the brand. You. Her lips parted slightly, as if that was the one confession she hadn't prepared for. Then why didn't you say anything? Because you were light. And I was already drowning. She closed her eyes, letting the words settle. When she opened them again, they weren't angry. Just tired. Do you know what it's like to break in front of thousands? To fall in a spotlight and hear the silence of millions? I do now, he said quietly. They stood that way for what felt like a season. The gallery around them buzzed with low chatter and clinking glasses, but their space remained untouched. Time bent around them, not forward, but inward. You helped build the conservatory again, she said, softer now. They told me. The scholarships. The rehabilitation wing. I had to do something. You did it quietly. I owed you silence. Grace tilted her head. That's not what I needed. What did you need? Presence, she whispered. Damien stepped closer. Close enough to hear the way her breath caught. Close enough to feel the space between them charged like a wire. Then let me be here now. She studied him. As if searching for signs that he would vanish again. I don't know if I can, trust this. You don't have to trust the future, he said. Just this room. Just this moment. A violinist began playing across the gallery, the notes slipping through the crowd like smoke. It was a song she knew. One she used to choreograph to alone, long before anyone thought her worth watching. He held out a hand. She stared at it. I haven't danced in years, she said. You already did, he answered. One step. That's all it took. The room faded as she reached out. Fingers touching fingers. Not clasping. Just, meeting. And in that second, the sound of the world softened. They didn't move. Not yet. But the invitation lingered between them. A promise, not of certainty, but of presence. I'm not who I was, she said. Good, he replied. She was beautiful. But I think this version of you, she terrifies me. Grace laughed. It was small, almost accidental. But it was real. They stood together, framed by metal and glass, by the echoes of a song that once belonged to a different lifetime. And though they didn't dance, not yet, everyone who saw them knew something had shifted. She took just one step. And he followed. The envelope had yellowed at the edges. Its seal was worn, as though it had been opened and closed 1,000 times but never truly read. Grace sat alone in the quiet of her apartment, the gallery brochure still on the table, Damien's business card half tucked beneath it. Her fingers hesitated over the flap of the envelope, heart already pounding like it knew what lay inside. She hadn't touched this in years. Not since the night the stage collapsed beneath her. Not since the world turned its back without even blinking. When she pulled the letter out, her hands trembled. It was dated 3 days after her fall. The handwriting was unmistakably his, sharp, structured, overly formal, like a man trying to hide his emotions in even spacing and ink. But the words, they didn't hide anything. Grace. I watched you fall. And I froze. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much. I wanted to run, to carry you out of that theater, to protect you from what I knew was coming. But I didn't. I failed you, not as a mentor, but as a man who loved you before he was allowed to. I didn't send this letter because I thought I had no right to interfere with your healing. But the truth is, I was a coward. And I've been paying for that cowardice every day since. D. She read it once. Then again. Each word felt like glass, sharp, transparent, and utterly incapable of being pieced together again. He had written this. He had tried. But it had never reached her. Why? A soft knock broke the silence. She folded the letter quickly, slid it beneath a book as if guilt could be hidden with paper. She walked to the door, expecting nothing but noise or perhaps the neighbor's child. But it wasn't a child. It was Lisette. The last person Grace ever expected to see again. Same dark eyes. Same perfect posture. Same scar just above the brow that no makeup ever truly covered. But her smile was different now, smaller. Less polished. Grace, she said softly. You look alive. I could say the same, Grace answered, stunned. They hadn't spoken since the gala 5 years ago. Not since that night when everything shattered. Not since Grace learned who had replaced her on the stage without even sending flowers to the hospital. I shouldn't have come unannounced, Lisette said, hesitating at the threshold. And yet you did. Lisette's eyes flicked down, ashamed. I saw the gallery footage. You were with him. Don't. You think I didn't know? He looked at you like you were the only thing in the room. Even then. Even when we were something. We were nothing, Grace said flatly. Because you let it mean nothing. That's not true, Lisette whispered. No. Grace stepped back, letting the weight of memory do what time couldn't. Then why did you tell the board I wasn't coming back? Why did you sign my name on the withdrawal form? Lisette's lips parted, but no sound came. You thought I wouldn't find out, Grace said. But I did. 2 months after I learned how to walk again. Lisette's voice cracked. I was scared, Grace. They offered me the lead. I thought you'd never dance again. That wasn't your choice. I know, she whispered. Silence fell between them like a curtain neither had the strength to lift. He wrote to me, Grace said suddenly. Damien. After the fall. Lisette blinked. He did. You didn't know. Lisette looked away. I thought, he gave me a letter to deliver once. I never read it. I didn't think. I thought it was for the foundation. Grace swallowed hard. You had it? Lisette nodded, eyes closing. I didn't know it was for you. Grace wanted to scream. To accuse. But something in her chest tightened instead. A different kind of pain. The kind that came not from betrayal, but from the waste of it all. The years lost. The words unsaid. I came to say I'm sorry, Lisette said. Not just for that. But for everything. For the way I left things. And what do you want now? Grace asked. To help. Grace almost laughed. Why would I let you help me? Because Damien is planning something. Something big. For you. And he doesn't know that you're not ready. Grace stilled. What do you mean? Lizette reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of thick cream-colored paper. A press release. The return of Grace Moreau, special performance at the Sovereign Theater. Her hands shook. She hadn't agreed to anything. She hadn't signed a contract. He booked the stage. Quietly. Privately. He's putting together a fundraiser in your name. The media doesn't know yet. But it's real. Grace stared at the page. Her name printed in gold. Her image watermarked behind the text, one she hadn't approved. From a photo that haunted her. He believes in you, Lizette said. But I don't think he knows what that fall really did to you. Grace said nothing. Because Lizette was right. She hadn't told Damien everything. He didn't know about the tremor that still haunted her left foot. Or the way she couldn't stand in silence without hearing phantom applause. Or the nightmare that returned every time she stepped onto wood floors. I'm not ready, she whispered. Lizette nodded. Then tell him. Or don't. But do something before this becomes another thing that breaks you. They didn't hug. Or cry. Or make promises. Lizette simply placed the press release on the table and walked out. Leaving Grace alone with her reflection in the darkened window. A dancer who had once commanded stages. Now unsure whether to walk into the light, or disappear for good. And across town, Damien stood beneath the glowing marquee of the Sovereign Theater, his hand against the cool stone. They were both standing on the edge of something. But neither knew if it would be a stage. Or a cliff. The theater lights were off. No velvet ropes. No murmurs of an eager crowd. Just rows of empty seats, cloaked in shadows, staring blankly at a stage that once knew her like a heartbeat. Grace stood in the wings of the Sovereign Theater, holding the press release Lizette had left behind. Her fingers creased the edge over and over, as if trying to smooth the truth out of it. Damien's voice cut through the stillness. I was hoping you'd come. She turned, not startled. She had known he'd be here, she could feel him in the silence, the same way you feel thunder before it arrives. He was leaning against the frame of the back entrance, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hands dusted with wood and dust and effort. I saw the flyer, she said flatly. I was going to tell you. When? After the lights went up. I wanted to give you something that no one else could take away again. She stepped forward. You think printing my name on a poster is giving me something? You think dragging my past onto a stage I haven't touched in years is healing? Damien's jaw clenched. No. I think it's truth. Yours. Grace's voice cracked before she meant it to. You don't know what that truth costs me. Then tell me. She laughed bitterly. You mean like I told you 6 years ago? When I asked if you believed in me, and you said you couldn't get involved? That's not what I said. You didn't have to. She walked toward center stage, the ghosts of her former self echoing around her. You watched me fall. And then you left. Damien moved closer, but not too close. I wrote to you. I never got it. He froze. She turned. Lizette had it. She thought it was for the foundation. His face darkened with something between disbelief and devastation. That letter, it explained everything. Then explain it now. Damien drew a breath that sounded like it hurt. You weren't just a dancer to me, Grace. You never were. But back then, I was your mentor, your director. I kept telling myself boundaries mattered more than honesty. You should have been there, she whispered. I wasn't brave enough. The silence that followed was full of things they never said. Finally, she asked, Why now? Why this? He took a step forward. Because I saw you at the gallery. And for a second, it felt like time hadn't moved. Like if I said the right words, we could go back. We can't go back, she said, shaking her head. Then let's go forward. She stared at him. Then, quietly, she said, there's something I never told you. Damien's breath caught. She turned her back to him, walked to the edge of the stage, and sat down slowly. Her voice was low. Fragile. After the fall, they told me I might never walk again. Not properly. Not enough to dance. And for a long time, I believed them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I remembered right before I hit the ground. He sat beside her, quiet. I remembered the night you touched my back for the first time, when we rehearsed that rooftop duet. You didn't even realize what it meant. But it stayed with me. Through the noise. The lights. Even through the pain. Damien looked down. I remember that night. I used to think that if I ever saw you again, I'd hate you. But you don't. I don't know what I feel. They sat there in a silence heavier than applause. Then Grace reached into her coat pocket. And pulled out a tiny, folded pair of ballet slippers. Miniature. Hand-stitched. Not worn. Damien stared. Grace looked at him. I was pregnant. He went still. I lost the baby 3 weeks after the fall. The words landed like stones dropped into deep water. Damien said nothing. Just breathed in sharply, his hands trembling slightly. You never knew, she said. I didn't deserve to. Grace shook her head. No. But you deserved the truth. His voice was raw. Was it mine? She turned to him, her eyes wet but unwavering. Yes. He closed his eyes. I didn't know what to do with that grief, she continued. I was broken, physically and emotionally. And I didn't want pity. I didn't want headlines. I wanted silence. That's why you disappeared. She nodded. I didn't want anyone to see me limp. Or mourn a child no one even knew existed. Damien looked at the slippers in her palm. He, or she, would have been 6 now. 6 and full of questions. Grace, he said softly, I would've. I know. But it's too late to be that person. What I need to know is if you can be this one. Here. Now. He met her gaze. I want to try, he whispered. Not to fix anything. Just to be part of what comes next. They sat there, years between them, pain between them, a child between them who had never drawn breath but had shaped their every step since. Finally, Grace stood. Her legs no longer trembled like they used to. She walked slowly to the center of the stage. No music. No spotlight. Just memory. She raised her arms. Closed her eyes. And took a step. Not perfect. Not even graceful. But steady. Damien watched, breath held. She turned slightly. And took another. A pirouette without speed. A reach without balance. But she was moving. She was dancing. And Damien, tears in his eyes, stood and joined her, not with steps, but with stillness. Not to lead her, but to witness her. Because some dances were not about the choreography. They were about survival. 3 days passed. 3 days of thunder that never reached the ground. Grace didn't return Damien's calls. Didn't reply to Lizette's increasingly panicked messages. And she hadn't stepped back into the theater since the night she stood beside Damien, ballet slippers folded in her palm like the past she finally set free. But she wasn't hiding. Not anymore. She was at the old community studio on Westmont Avenue, the first place she ever learned to move in rhythm. The mirrors were cracked, the floors uneven. But Grace wasn't there to be watched. She was there to remember. Her body moved through stretches slowly, like dust brushing off memory. She didn't bring music. Just breath and silence. And in that silence, Damien waited. Not at the studio. He respected her need for space, but he couldn't silence the ache of uncertainty. He sat in the audience chamber of the Sovereign Theatre, where her name was now painted in gold foil on the front of the gala program. He flipped through it like scripture, every word weighed down with what-ifs. Then Lisette entered. She didn't speak. Just walked down the aisle and dropped a thick folder into the seat beside him. "I found the original letter," she said. He looked at her. She didn't meet his eyes. "It was mine to deliver. 6 years ago." He opened the folder. It wasn't just his letter. It was hers too. Grace's. A letter she had written but never sent. Damien's hands shook as he scanned the words. "If I see you again, I won't ask why you left. I'll ask if you still remember how to hold silence the way dancers hold air, fragile but full of faith." Lisette sat down quietly. "I kept it. I thought I was protecting her from another heartbreak. But I was wrong." Damien ran a hand through his hair, breathing in shards. "She told me about the child." Lisette's eyes softened. "She never told anyone. Not even me. I didn't just lose her," he said. "I lost everything I never knew I needed." He stood. And left the theater. By the time he reached the old community studio, dusk had smeared itself across the sky. The door was locked. The windows dark. He hesitated, heart pounding, then slipped a note under the door. 3 words. "I remember everything." He didn't wait. That night, Grace sat on her rooftop in silence, the stars scattered like loose pearls above her. Her fingers traced the edges of the old slippers resting beside her. She had once called them a memory. Tonight, they felt more like a bridge. The next morning, she returned to the Sovereign. Damien wasn't there. But his footprints were. Literal ones, chalked lightly on the marley floor of the stage. A trail of dance steps, childlike and uneven, ending in a pair of tiny drawn feet labeled, Hope. Grace covered her mouth, laughter and tears braided together. She sat cross-legged at the edge of the stage, tracing the word, Hope, with her fingertips. That's when she heard it. The piano. Soft. Uncertain. Not from the main system. From the back room. The old rehearsal upright, dusty, and nearly forgotten. She followed the sound. Damien sat at the keys, back straight but hands tentative. He didn't see her. He was playing the lullaby. The one they'd created years ago in the dark, never written, never named. The one she used to hum under her breath when her knees ached from rehearsals and her heart ached from the things left unsaid. She waited until he reached the final note before stepping inside. "You remembered it wrong," she said softly. He turned. "It ends in F minor," she continued, walking over. Damien slid to the side. She sat next to him. Together, they played the last notes in harmony. When the sound faded, he said, "I wanted you to find it. The trail. The music. Me." "I did," she said. There was a long pause before she whispered, "I'm scared." "Of what?" "That I'll forgive you. And it'll still hurt." Damien's voice dropped. "It will. Then why should I?" He looked at her, not with hope, but with surrender. "Because you already have." She inhaled sharply. "I've seen you forgive yourself," he added. "Every time you move. Every time you breathe past the pain. You just haven't realized you deserve to forgive someone else too." Her hands trembled slightly. Damien reached into his pocket. He pulled out a program for the gala. On the back, he'd written only one line. "If you take one step, I'll meet you with 2. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she nodded. Once. They stood together. No declarations. No fanfare. Just presence. The next few weeks moved like a dream stitched with threadbare courage. Rehearsals resumed. Not for a performance, but for healing. Grace didn't commit to the gala. But she showed up. Watched. Stepped in when the understudy couldn't keep the timing. Lisette watched from the wings, smiling with something that looked a lot like redemption. One afternoon, a little girl from the children's outreach program walked up to Grace and tugged on her sleeve. "Are you the lady who forgot how to dance?" Grace knelt. "I thought I did. But you're dancing now." Grace smiled. "Sometimes we just need someone to remind us." The girl offered her a daisy she'd been keeping in her pocket. Crumpled but bright. Grace took it. On the day of the gala, the Sovereign Theater buzzed with anticipation. Cameras flashed. The lobby shimmered with gowns and promises. Backstage, Grace stood in front of the mirror. She wasn't in costume. Just a simple black dress. Flats instead of point shoes. Her hair pulled back like it had been the first time she ever stepped on stage as a child. Damien entered. "They're waiting." She looked at him through the mirror. "Let them." He stepped closer. "Do you want to dance tonight?" She turned. "I already did," she whispered. "The moment I forgave you." And in the hush between heartbeat and spotlight, Damien understood. Forgiveness wasn't a scene. It was a step. And she had taken it. The curtains hadn't opened yet. But the theater was already holding its breath. Outside the Sovereign, cars lined the street like a red carpet of anticipation. Inside, champagne flutes clinked softly, programs rustled like whispers, and spotlights carved gold into the velvet air. On stage, the orchestra tuned to the note of something more than music, something like return. Backstage, Grace stood still. Not in fear. Not in doubt. But in stillness so complete it felt holy. She wasn't wearing the silk gown the sponsors sent. She had folded it away quietly that morning and chosen her own dress, simple, flowing, with a neckline her mother once said made her look like sunlight. Her shoes weren't heels or point shoes. Just soft slippers. She reached up and unpinned her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. Lisette entered the dressing room with a clipboard in hand, looking every bit the professional. Until she saw Grace. And stopped. "You're not in the run order," she said quietly. "I know," Grace replied. Lisette nodded slowly. "Then, why are you here?" Grace smiled, and her answer was so soft it barely made it across the space between them. "To remind myself I still belong." Lisette placed the clipboard on the vanity. "You never stopped." There was silence between them for a beat. Then Lisette added, "He's waiting by the wings." Grace didn't move yet. She looked into the mirror, and for the first time in years, she didn't search for who she used to be. She simply saw herself. Present. Open. Whole. She rose, took a deep breath, and walked out, each step not toward the spotlight, but toward the quiet edge of a stage she once believed she'd never touch again. Damien stood there. Tie undone. Hands clenched in nervous stillness. When he saw her, he didn't speak. Neither did she. He offered his arm. She took it. The audience hadn't noticed them yet. The MC was finishing introductions. Applause rippled like a distant tide. But backstage, where the light hadn't reached yet, Grace turned to Damien. "Whatever happens tonight," she whispered, "this isn't about proving anything." He nodded. "It never was." A beat. Then she added, "It's about reclaiming everything I gave up, just to survive." "I know," he whispered back. "And if the world is lucky, they'll get to witness it." She let go of his arm. and walked on stage. Alone. The stage was empty. No props. No set. Just space. The crowd hushed immediately. Spotlights dimmed. And the room held its breath. Then, a single piano note. Followed by another. Not the gala overture. Not a showpiece. It was the lullaby. Soft, tender, incomplete, until Grace stepped into it. She didn't dance. Not yet. She stood. Facing the audience. For a long moment, she simply breathed. Then she spoke. Her voice quiet, but it carried like truth through silk. I once believed silence meant safety. That if I stayed still enough, long enough, no one would notice I was breaking. The room stayed frozen. But silence, she continued, was never safety. It was a waiting room. For this moment. She looked down at her feet. Then up at the audience. I'm not here to perform tonight, she said. I'm here to return. And then, she danced. No choreography. No counts. Just movement that bloomed from something deeper than memory. A trembling arm raised to the light. A slow, hesitant pirouette. A moment where she stumbled and didn't hide it. A breath that became rhythm. A bend that became grace. The music followed her, not the other way around. And in that space, in that stillness carved into motion, something extraordinary happened. The crowd didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They stood. In silence. Not because it was over. But because something sacred had passed through them. When she finished, Grace didn't bow. She simply stood still again, only this time, with nothing left to hide. From the wings, Damien watched. And in his eyes was not pride or awe, but reverence. She returned to the wings. Damien stepped back instinctively, as if not to interrupt the gravity around her. But she stopped. And looked at him. I'm ready now, she said. For what? For the part where I get to live. His voice cracked. With me? With or without you, she said gently. But yes, if you're willing to start where everything almost ended. He nodded. I've been waiting at that edge every day. Lizette approached them slowly. In her hand was a small box. I found this in the office drawer, she said, placing it in Grace's hand. Grace opened it. Inside, her old necklace. A silver charm shaped like a shoe with wings. The one Damien had given her the night before she left the city 6 years ago. I thought I lost it, she whispered. No, Lizette said, you just weren't ready to wear it again. Grace held it tightly. The gala continued, but she no longer needed the stage. The next day, she visited the small outreach studio again, not as a student or a lost soul, but as a mentor. The children gathered around her like sunflowers. One of them asked, "Are you famous now?" Grace smiled. "No," she said. "But I'm free." The little girl with the daisy from weeks ago hugged her tight. "Can I dance like you one day?" "You already do," Grace said. "Every time you keep going." Time passed. Not all at once. But kindly. 3 months later, Grace opened her own community program. Not for dancers seeking stages, but for anyone needing movement to find themselves again. Damien supported quietly. Never front and center. He understood now that love wasn't grand gestures. It was presence. Steady. Gentle. On a Sunday morning in late spring, Grace stood beneath a willow tree in the garden behind the studio. The place was filled with people. Friends. Students. Families. Strangers who'd heard the story. At the front, a simple arch of white flowers. Beside her, Damien. She took his hand. And they said their vows, not with fanfare, but with truth. When the ceremony ended, there was no dramatic kiss or roaring applause. Just one step forward. Grace lifted the hem of her dress and danced. Just once. In the middle of a garden where every leaf whispered freedom. Damien followed, laughing. And the world watched, not because she had returned to the spotlight, but because she no longer needed it. She had become the light.